everybody knows that Nobuo Uematsu is one of the greatest musical minds in the video game industry, and in any kind of conversation about the best video game composers, you know that Uematsu's name is going to come up and come up fast. But why is that exactly? Is it his ability to tell a story through musical themes that develop across entire soundtracks? Is it his reputation for writing enormous, mind-blowing final boss themes? Yes, well yeah, I mean, it's both of those mostly. Or at least those are the reasons most people would give. But I submit to you today my theory that what Uematsu does best isn't actually thematic development or grandiose final boss themes. The thing that Uematsu does best is create vibes. Now, not exactly an academic term, but I really think vibes are an important part of a piece of music, and the element of a piece that reaches people more than any other. They're that intangible quality that soaks into you from the piece. The atmosphere, the part that puts you in a certain mood, and you don't need to know anything about music to feel that. A huge part of what gives a piece of music a vibe is the texture of the piece, which can pretty much be boiled down to which instruments are playing and how. To have a clear musical texture with a specific effect on the music, I think it's important to be able to describe the texture in short, simple terms. A formula I use sometimes to get a good starting point is to note the instruments at play, the physical method or technique that they're using to play, an emotional adjective, and if necessary, the dynamic being used. For example, strings playing in a quiet but aggressive tremolo sounds like this. This certainly sets a vibe right from the very first note, and you can tell that this description is a good one because if you changed any of these elements, the vibe of the music would drastically change. If it weren't strings playing, if they weren't playing tremolo, if they were playing lightly and softly, any of these changes would create a completely different vibe from the one we got. This is a strong and clear musical texture. That was a track called Black Waltz from Final Fantasy IX. Now, Final Fantasy IX is a special game, being the last in the series for which Uematsu was solely responsible for the music. And the sheer number of different ideas you'll find if you listen through the 160 some odd tracks written for the game is staggering. The soundtrack showcases Uematsu's deep understanding of how to create vibes, and the role of unique and interesting musical textures in that pursuit, which makes the score a perfect vehicle for analysis. So, without further ado, join me on the first of this two-part exploration into the vibes of Final Fantasy IX. Each of the examples featured in this video are arrangements of the main theme of the game, Melodies of Life. This theme is rearranged into tons of different variations throughout the game, and while each maintains the core melodic and harmonic identity of the theme, they also all create their own unique vibe through the use of a wide variety of musical textures. This is great because it means we can basically isolate the effect that the melody and harmony have on the vibe of a piece and pick apart what the other elements of the arrangement bring to the table in each iteration. The official arrangement of the main theme of the game, titled Melodies of Life on the soundtrack, is a vocal pop ballad arrangement heard over the game's credits. Let's take a listen, and while we do, I want you to think about how you would describe the vibe or atmosphere of the song. I'd say the vibe of the arrangement is calm, a little bittersweet, and a little bit cheesy, but in kind of a fun way. There are a lot of factors that go into creating this vibe, of course. The vocal performance plays a huge part, and the soft rock rhythm section and string section accompaniment is probably responsible for the sense of calm and also the cheesiness. The piece was written by Uematsu, but this specific arrangement was done by Shiro Hamaguchi, and while it definitely accomplishes what it sets out to do, the musical texture isn't nearly as clear, inventive, or striking as what you find in a lot of Uematsu's work. For example, let's compare it to the track South Gate, which plays in the Aerbs Mountains, where Uematsu scored the main theme for a trio of recorders. Again, while you listen, try and think about what words come to mind that you would use to describe this vibe. The pop ballad cheese is gone, stripped away along with the suspended piano seconds and high string pads, and what's left in its place feels so much more potent to me. There's nothing for the recorders to hide behind, and this transparency makes the strength of the composition much clearer and requires each recorder part to have something more interesting going on to carry the weight of the arrangement. The bottom two recorder parts masterfully weave contrapuntally through the arrangement, sometimes following the melody's contour and sometimes breaking off with little flourishes or added chromatic passing tones. It's amazing how this arrangement, which the entirety of fits comfortably on one staff, doesn't feel like it's missing anything. In fact, Uematsu leans into the bareness of this orchestration. Listen to the start of the B section where he gives us just a single B-flat note on one recorder held for 2 full beats before the others join in with the melody harmonized in sixths. If I was writing this piece, I would be so worried that that bar would feel too bare, make the listener feel uncomfortable, or make it sound like I didn't know what I was doing, but what it really does here is create anticipation. This whole version of the theme has so much more weight to it than the full band vocal arrangement to me. Maybe I'm the odd one out here, but for me, I consider this piece to have one of the strongest vibes on the soundtrack. If I had to describe this texture with one sentence like I talked about earlier, I think I would say thoughtful recorder counterpoint. To demonstrate just how fragile this kind of vibe is, let's change just one element of the texture. The harmony, melody, orchestration, and note choices of each part will all stay the same. All we're going to change is the rhythmic feel, from a slow 8th note subdivision to a quicker triplet or 6/8 feel. Doesn't that just ruin the whole thing? A vibe isn't just dependent on what instruments are playing, but how these instruments are playing as well. Rhythmically, dynamically, what choices with regards to tone are made, even arrangements that seem simple on paper are carefully balancing hundreds of decisions, whether made consciously or not, that all add together to create the vibe of the piece. You don't often hear recorder trio in video game music, but the choice of recorders was made to fit the game's general medieval European aesthetic. Uematsu even took a trip to Europe for inspiration working on the game, but he mentioned in an interview with Famitsu that he decided to break away from a purely medieval-inspired sound to keep the soundtrack interesting. You can hear this decision throughout the game in Uematsu's fantastic ability to balance and combine different types of instrumental textures in the same piece. In Over the Hill, the game's overworld theme, Uematsu starts off with this synth line playing a syncopated figure over top of some light string pads. The timbre of the synth, with the multiple wide leaps between notes and steady rhythmic pattern, contrasts the gentle hum of the strings underneath in a way that gives me what I can only describe as spaceship cockpit vibes. A spaceship cockpit might be conceptually as far away from medieval Europe as it gets, but worlds collide soon enough. After the first statement of the melody by a high synth part, a full rhythm section comes in and two recorders join to harmonize the melody in thirds. I love how the cold spaceship cockpit synth line continues alongside the more earthy sounds of acoustic guitar, fretless bass, drums, and recorders, mixing together both organic and synthesized textures to create this rich, nuanced sound. It's not as easy to sum up in one sentence as some of the earlier examples, but the texture of this arrangement brings a completely different vibe to the main theme, in spite of using the exact same melody and harmony as the other iterations we've looked at so far. Possibly my favorite example of this mixing of organic and synthesized instrumentation is in the track Garnet's Theme, which naturally plays in some of the key plot moments involving the character Garnet. This time we kick the piece off with an organic texture, a wind trio of flute, clarinet, and bassoon setting up a colorful 8th note pattern over top of an A bass pedal. Such a cool vibe set up right from the very start, and it's all thanks to this genius musical texture. We're staying stationary on an A major chord for 4 bars, but the 8th note pattern harmonized by flute and clarinet propels the music forward rhythmically and harmonically. First, each part leaps up from a low note on the beat to hit a higher note on the offbeats, which creates some rhythmic energy, but the highest note in the pattern is on the and of 2, the direct center of the bar. Accenting this part of the measure feels like a rhythmic anticipation of beat 3, which creates a lot of musical momentum, and repeating this figure bar after bar gives us this engine of rhythmic energy that propels the music forward. On top of this, the clarinet part jumps up to hit a D on this mid-bar accent, the 4th of our A chord, which creates a surprising amount of harmonic tension. The fact that the clarinet leaps up to this non-chord tone and then leaps down again makes it stick out, and this creates a sense of harmonic movement. Here, listen to how much more stagnant this pattern sounds with this D replaced with a C sharp, which expresses the harmony much more clearly. It's amazing how one note change can just suck the life out of a musical figure. This rolling engine 8th note pattern in the winds is a musical texture that runs throughout Garnet's theme, and in my opinion it's more than enough to carry the tune on its own. That's not the only cool textural idea here though. When the melody comes in, it's played by this strange icy synth that sounds completely otherworldly in comparison to the sound of the winds that set up the tune. This, plus the introduction of electric bass guitar to cover the bass line once the melody comes in, means that the more natural sound of the woodwinds is sandwiched in between unnatural electronic sounds. Even with such a textural contrast between the different instruments used here, they all work together to build this dreamy, beautiful vibe. You've almost certainly never heard a quartet of electric bass, flute, clarinet, and this kind of glassy synth before, but I'm sure glad I have now. The flute and clarinet parts add to the dreamy quality by sticking to the same notes as much as possible as the bass note moves from chord to chord. The same pattern is transposed after the intro to fit over a D chord rather than an A chord, but as the bass moves on to the next chord, B minor, and the following G, the wind part doesn't actually change at all. In fact, throughout the whole arrangement, this wind pattern only changes just enough as to not completely clash with the underlying harmony, and so we get this cool thing happening where we have a kind of implied pedaled chord voicing that stays basically static over top of a changing bass line. These add all sorts of colorful upper extensions to the various chords they appear over, as well as contribute to the ambient, dreamy quality of the piece. Listen to that and just try and tell me Uematsu isn't the king of vibes. Just try it! We find a completely different vibe in the track Distant Memory, which plays through several different flashback sequences found throughout the game. Once again, the vibe is potent and driven by a unique musical texture. A piano slowly rolls up a series of chords, stopping to repeat the top note of each chord for a full bar. This repeated top note is echoed one step below and one half beat off by a vibraphone, creating a dissonant clash between the two instruments, with a healthy helping of reverb and cool stereo left to right panning tricks in the vibraphone part adding to the texture. It's examples like this that reveal to me just how obsessed Uematsu must be with the details of his compositions. I certainly would never have thought to give this echoing offbeat note to a vibraphone from out of nowhere, but after witnessing the atmosphere it creates, I can't imagine this piece any other way. You truly could not get these vibes without using those vibes. As much as this video is supposed to be focusing on texture, this atmosphere wouldn't be possible without this harmony. These 6-note piano chords are actually 3-note chordioids doubled an octave up, and don't rely on functional harmonic logic quite as much as on voice leading to get from chord to chord. This first chord, or chordioid, I made a video about it, go check it out, is a tonic E minor 7 chord without the third, stacking up E, B, and D notes. This kind of chordioid has a really open, ambiguous sound. Going through the 4-chord pattern, just one note changes from chord to chord. First, the D lowers to C, making an E chordioid with the 5th and flat 6, which rub together in this great dissonant way. The root, E, then lowers to a D sharp, creating this interesting B7 flat 9 over D sharp kind of sound, but without the flat 7th and 5th of the chord. It feels like a very dissonant 5 chord in the key of E minor, and it's very, very unstable. The final chord in the progression sees both B and C notes dropping down a step to A and B, forming a much more stable and obvious B7 chord to set up a return to our chordioid tonic. After this pattern is established, bassoon, clarinet, and flute in turn play snippets of the game's main theme transposed to fit into an E minor scale. The low bassoon melody sounds great, and I love how crunchy the flute part gets with this F natural over top of the B7 flat 9 kind of chord, but to be honest, these winds are just coasting on the great vibe set up by the piano and vibraphone. It's such a short piece, but to me it represents so much of what Uematsu does well as a composer. Creative use of leitmotifs, use of unique and interesting textures, and most of all, creating a perfect vibe. I tried to focus mostly on musical texture in this video, but there's a lot more that goes into building the vibe of a piece of music. In part 2 of this 2-part series, I'll be taking a look at some of the finer details of vibe construction by dissecting the theme of the game's main antagonist, Kuja. Look forward to it. Big thanks to OrGamecha and James Michael Sellers for requesting Final Fantasy IX in the first place. If you want to support the channel, check out my Patreon page here. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all in part 2.